World War II, one of the most devastating conflicts in human history, ended in 1945, leaving the world profoundly changed. Over 70 million people had perished, cities lay in ruins, and nations were left to rebuild amidst unimaginable economic and social devastation. The war not only redrew maps but also reshaped the global balance of power, setting the stage for a new era of geopolitical tension. While World War II brought immense destruction, it also established the foundation for international cooperation, leading to the creation of institutions such as the United Nations, designed to prevent future global conflicts. Despite these efforts, the seeds for a future confrontation were already sown. The ideological divide between the United States and the Soviet Union gave birth to the Cold War, a period of intense political and military tension that lasted nearly half a century. The world experienced a prolonged standoff marked by nuclear threats, proxy wars, and an arms race that kept humanity on edge. While open conflict was avoided, the competition for dominance, resources, and technological superiority intensified, creating conditions that could one day spark a more devastating global war. Aftermath of World War II. The conclusion of World War II left Europe and Asia in ruins. Germany was divided, Japan was occupied, and the United Nations emerged as an institution aimed at fostering dialogue and peace. The Marshall Plan facilitated Europe's economic recovery, yet deep-rooted tensions persisted. Countries were rebuilding not only physically, but also politically, struggling to find a balance between nationalism, socialism, and emerging democratic ideals. Meanwhile, former colonial empires were weakening, leading to decolonization movements across Asia and Africa, adding another layer of global instability. The Cold War's onset transformed former allies into ideological adversaries. Military alliances such as NATO and the Warsaw Pact solidified, and nations were forced to navigate a bipolar world. The nuclear arms race escalated, with both superpowers amassing stockpiles capable of annihilating humanity. Scientific advancements accelerated, fueling both progress and potential destruction. Space exploration, computing, and missile technology were no longer purely scientific endeavors. They became instruments of national power and global influence, seeds of future conflict. Although World War II had ended, global tensions never fully dissipated. Regional conflicts, competition over resources, and nationalistic ambitions persisted throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, and drone technology have transformed the modern battlefield, making a hypothetical World War III potentially more devastating than any previous war. Population growth, climate change, and economic disparities further heighten the risk of future global confrontations. If these pressures converge, humanity may face a war unlike any other, a war fought not only with soldiers, but with technology, information, and strategic influence on a planetary scale. The end of World War II in 1945 did not bring about global peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new kind of warfare, a struggle for ideological, political, and economic supremacy known as the Cold War. While the battlefields of Europe and Asia were silent, a different kind of conflict was brewing, one that was fought not with armies in trenches, but through espionage, propaganda, proxy wars, and an unprecedented arms race. The world was entering a tense period where the threat of total annihilation loomed, even in the absence of direct combat between the superpowers. Division of the world. The immediate aftermath of World War II saw the division of Europe into spheres of influence. The United States and its allies championed capitalism and democracy, rebuilding Western Europe through programs like the Marshall Plan, which injected billions of dollars into war-torn economies. Conversely, the Soviet Union consolidated its influence over Eastern Europe, installing communist governments across Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other nations. Berlin, the epicenter of Cold War tensions, became a literal and symbolic divide between East and West. This division was not just political, but ideological. The United States promoted free market capitalism, private property, and liberal democracy, while the Soviet Union pushed for state-controlled economies, collectivization, and centralized authoritarian control. Each superpower saw the other's ideology as an existential threat, creating a global atmosphere of suspicion and rivalry. This binary world structure forced nearly every nation to align with one of the two sides, setting the stage for proxy wars and regional conflicts that would last for decades. The arms race and nuclear threats. One of the most dangerous aspects of the Cold War was the nuclear arms race. The United States had already demonstrated the devastating power of atomic weapons. One of the most dangerous aspects of the Cold War was the nuclear arms race. The United States had already demonstrated the devastating power of atomic weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union quickly developed its own nuclear arsenal, triggering an era of mutual deterrence known as MAD, mutually assured destruction. The logic of MAD was chilling. Any nuclear attack by one superpower would result in total retaliation, ensuring the complete destruction of both. This led to stockpiling thousands of nuclear warheads, development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and the creation of elaborate civil defense programs. Underground bunkers, early warning systems, and even duck-and-cover drills in schools became symbols of an anxious generation living under the shadow of potential annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 epitomized the world's proximity to nuclear war, as the US and USSR came within days of a conflict that could have escalated into World War III. Proxy wars and global conflicts. Direct confrontation between the superpowers was avoided, but numerous proxy wars occurred across the globe, each serving as a battleground for ideological supremacy. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, and conflicts in the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America all reflected the broader struggle between capitalism and communism. These conflicts were devastating for the nations directly involved. Millions of civilians died, economies collapsed, and social structures were destabilized. The US and USSR supplied weapons, training, and military advisors, but rarely deployed large-scale forces directly. This indirect warfare allowed the superpowers to exert influence while avoiding the catastrophic consequences of a direct nuclear confrontation. Yet it created long-lasting instability across entire regions. Technological and space race. The Cold War also sparked a technological and scientific competition. The launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union in 1957 shocked the United States and triggered the space race, symbolizing not just technological superiority, but also military potential. Satellites, intercontinental missiles, and space exploration became intertwined with national security, as both superpowers sought global dominance in every arena. Beyond space, computing, cryptography, and electronic surveillance advanced rapidly. Both nations invested heavily in research and development, giving rise to technologies that would eventually transform the world, but also tools that could be used for unprecedented destruction. The Cold War era, therefore, was not merely a period of political tension. It was a time of rapid scientific evolution, much of which was directly linked to military applications and future warfare. The world on edge. For nearly 5 decades, the world existed in a state of high tension, constantly aware that a single miscalculation could trigger a catastrophic war. Civil defense measures, political alliances, and global diplomacy worked to prevent direct conflict, but uncertainty persisted. Every conflict, from the Berlin blockade to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, was a reminder of how fragile peace truly was. This tense balance between superpowers established the framework for a hypothetical World War III. By the end of the Cold War in 1991, the immediate threat of nuclear conflict had decreased, but the geopolitical rivalries, regional conflicts, and technological arms competitions had not disappeared. Instead, they transformed into new forms of power struggles, setting the stage for future global confrontations in the 21st century. The Cold War officially ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, marking a seismic shift in global geopolitics. The world, once divided into two ideological camps, suddenly found itself in a unipolar era dominated by the United States. This shift opened opportunities for economic growth, technological innovation, and diplomatic cooperation, but it also introduced new challenges and unforeseen risks that would shape the modern world and lay the foundation for potential global conflicts in the 21st century. The rise of new powers. With the end of the Cold War, previously suppressed or emerging nations began to assert themselves on the global stage. China experienced rapid economic growth and modernization, transforming from a regional player into a global powerhouse. Its growing influence in Asia, Africa, and the South China Sea presented new strategic challenges to Western powers. Similarly, countries such as India, Brazil, and Russia, the successor state of the USSR, began pursuing regional dominance and global influence, creating a multipolar world where competition for resources, markets, and alliances intensified. This rise of new powers coincided with the gradual decline of traditional Western dominance. While the United States remained a superpower, its relative influence was increasingly challenged by rapidly developing economies. Trade wars, territorial disputes, and geopolitical tensions became more frequent, reflecting a world in which power was no longer concentrated but dispersed among multiple ambitious states. Regional conflicts and humanitarian crises. The post-Cold War era was also marked by numerous regional conflicts that destabilized entire continents. Wars in the Balkans, the Middle East, and Africa exposed the fragility of post-Cold War peace. The Gulf Wars, the Iraq invasion, and the Syrian civil war demonstrated how localized conflicts could draw in global powers either directly or through proxy support. These conflicts were often fueled by ethnic, religious, and political divisions, complicating diplomacy and preventing long-term resolution. Refugee crises, famine, and mass displacement became hallmarks of modern warfare. Millions of civilians were forced to flee conflict zones, creating humanitarian emergencies and straining neighboring countries. These crises highlighted the interconnected nature of modern global conflict. What begins as a regional war can rapidly have worldwide economic, political, and social repercussions. Technology as a force multiplier. Unlike previous wars, modern conflicts are increasingly technology-driven. The rise of cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, unmanned drones, and satellite-based surveillance has changed the rules of engagement. Countries can now strike enemies indirectly by disrupting critical infrastructure, financial networks, and communication systems without deploying troops. This new type of warfare is asymmetric. Smaller nations or non-state actors can challenge superpowers using advanced technology, creating uncertainty and instability. Cyber attacks on power grids, water supply systems, and financial networks are no longer hypothetical. They are real threats that could escalate tensions between nuclear-armed states, increasing the risk of miscalculation. Resource scarcity and environmental pressures. Another modern trigger for conflict is competition over scarce resources. Freshwater shortages, energy scarcity, arable land, and rare minerals are increasingly becoming sources of tension. Climate change exacerbates these pressures, forcing nations to compete for habitable territory and critical resources. Rising sea levels, droughts, and desertification threaten global food security, which in turn can ignite social unrest, cross-border conflicts, and proxy wars. Environmental factors combined with political instability make modern conflicts more complex than previous wars. Unlike World War II, which was largely territorial, 21st century conflicts are likely to involve economic, environmental, and technological dimensions simultaneously. Rising nationalism and geopolitical rivalries. The post-Cold War world also witnessed a resurgence of nationalism and populism. Countries increasingly prioritized national interests over global cooperation, undermining international institutions designed to maintain peace. Disputes over borders, trade, and spheres of influence, such as tensions in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and Eastern Europe, reflect a world where diplomacy is fragile and small incidents can escalate rapidly. Combined with modern military technology, these rivalries create conditions where a regional skirmish could escalate into a global confrontation. The lessons of history, from the miscalculations that led to World War I to the chain reactions of World War II, remain highly relevant. Modern states must navigate these challenges carefully, as a single misstep could trigger a large-scale war unlike any humanity has seen before. Conclusion of Part 3. The post-Cold War era illustrates that peace is never permanent. The rise of new global powers, regional conflicts, technological advancements, resource scarcity, and nationalism collectively create a volatile environment. While humanity has never been closer to global connectivity and technological sophistication, it is also closer to forms of warfare that are unpredictable, rapid, and potentially catastrophic. The world may have left the Cold War behind, but the seeds for future large-scale conflicts, potentially a World War III scenario, have been sown in the dynamics of the 21st century. Understanding these trends is critical to preparing for the challenges that lie ahead. As the world moves deeper into the 21st century, the nature of global conflict continues to evolve. Unlike World War I and World War II, which erupted suddenly after clear triggering events, a potential World War III would likely emerge gradually, through a series of escalating crises rather than a single declaration of war. Political tensions, technological competition, and regional instability could combine to push the world into a state of continuous conflict, where the line between peace and war becomes increasingly blurred. The concept of red zones. In a modern global conflict, the idea of a traditional battlefield is outdated. Instead, future wars are expected to revolve around red zones, high-risk regions where military, economic, and strategic interests collide. These zones may include contested borders, critical trade routes, cyberspace, and even outer space. Red zones are not limited to one country. They can exist simultaneously across continents, creating a decentralized and persistent state of warfare. Examples of potential red zones include strategically vital seas, disputed territories, and regions rich in natural resources. Control over these areas would be essential for maintaining global influence, access to energy supplies, and military dominance. Unlike past wars, civilians living within red zones would face constant surveillance, drone activity, cyber disruptions, and psychological warfare, even without large-scale ground invasions. Triggers that could spark World War III would not begin with a single dramatic event, but rather a chain reaction of escalating incidents. A regional conflict between two rival states could draw in allies through defense treaties. A major cyber attack on a nation's power grid or financial system could be interpreted as an act of war. Even misinformation or a false flag operation could provoke retaliation before diplomatic channels have time to respond. Nuclear weapons remain a central deterrent, but they also increase the danger of miscalculation. Unlike the Cold War, modern decision-making is faster and often automated. Artificial intelligence systems, early warning sensors, and rapid response military doctrines could reduce human oversight, increasing the risk of accidental escalation. In such an environment, even a small error could trigger catastrophic consequences. New forms of warfare. World War III would differ fundamentally from previous global conflicts. Cyber warfare would be a primary weapon, targeting communication networks, transportation systems, hospitals, and financial institutions. Artificial intelligence would be used for battlefield analysis, autonomous drones, and predictive strike systems. Space-based assets such as satellites would become military targets, disrupting navigation, intelligence gathering, and global connectivity. Traditional armies would still exist, but they would operate alongside unmanned systems, private military contractors, and information warfare units. Social media platforms could become battlefields themselves, used to manipulate public opinion, spread panic, and destabilize governments from within. War would no longer be confined to soldiers. It would affect every citizen connected to the digital world. Global impact in civilian life. In a hypothetical war-free scenario, civilian life would be permanently altered. Supply chains could collapse, causing shortages of food, medicine, and energy. Cities within red zones might experience rolling blackouts, cyber disruptions, and constant uncertainty. Refugee numbers would surpass anything seen in previous wars, placing enormous pressure on neighboring countries and international organizations. Economically, global markets would become highly unstable. Trade routes could be blocked, currencies devalued, and international cooperation severely weakened. The psychological impact on humanity, living under constant threat without a clear front line, could be as damaging as physical destruction itself. Transition toward a new world order. Rather than ending with a clear victory, World War III might conclude through exhaustion, negotiated settlements, or technological stalemates. The result would likely be a transformed global order, with new power structures, altered borders, and revised international rules. Nations that adapt quickly to technological warfare and resource management would emerge stronger, while others could face long-term decline. Closing of Part 4. Part 4 illustrates that a future world war would not resemble the conflicts of the past. It would be fragmented, technology-driven, and persistent, with red zones replacing traditional battlefields. The danger lies not only in weapons, but in speed, misinformation, and the interconnected nature of modern civilization. Understanding these dynamics is essential if humanity hopes to avoid repeating history or survive it. If a hypothetical World War III were to unfold, its most devastating impact would not be limited to battlefields or military targets. Instead, the greatest cost would be borne by civilians, whose lives, livelihoods, and futures would be disrupted on a global scale. Unlike previous wars where destruction was often localized, a modern world war would affect nearly every nation through interconnected economic systems, digital infrastructure, and global supply chains. The humanitarian crisis. One of the earliest consequences of a global conflict would be an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. Cities within red zones would become uninhabitable due to constant threats from airstrikes, drone surveillance, cyber disruptions, and shortages of basic necessities. Hospitals could lose power, clean water systems could fail, and access to medicine would become severely limited. Mass displacement would follow. Millions, possibly hundreds of millions, of people would be forced to flee their homes, creating the largest refugee crisis in human history. Neighboring countries would struggle to absorb these populations, leading to overcrowded camps, disease outbreaks, and rising social tensions. International aid organizations, already stretched thin, would find it nearly impossible to operate safely in active conflict zones. Psychological and social impact beyond physical destruction. The psychological toll of a prolonged global conflict would be immense. Constant exposure to fear, misinformation, and uncertainty would affect entire generations. Children growing up in wartime conditions would face interrupted education, trauma, and long-term mental health challenges. Societies could experience increased polarization, mistrust, and breakdown of social cohesion. As governments impose emergency measures, surveillance, and restrictions, civil liberties might be reduced in the name of national security. The balance between safety and freedom would become one of the most difficult ethical challenges of a world at war. Economic collapse and global supply chains. The global economy, deeply interconnected through trade, technology, and finance, would be extremely vulnerable during World War III. Key trade routes could be disrupted, ports closed, and manufacturing hubs destroyed or disabled. Energy supplies, oil, gas, and electricity, would become strategic weapons, leading to widespread shortages and price shocks. Financial markets would face extreme volatility. Currencies could collapse, inflation could surge, and unemployment would rise sharply as industries shut down. Developing nations would suffer disproportionately, lacking the resources to stabilize their economies or provide adequate support to their populations. Even wealthy nations would struggle to maintain economic stability under prolonged conflict conditions. Food, water, and resource scarcity. Modern civilization depends on complex systems to deliver food and clean water. A global war would severely disrupt agriculture through land destruction, climate impacts, and supply chain failures. Food shortages could trigger famine in vulnerable regions, while water scarcity could ignite additional conflicts, both within and between nations. Competition over essential resources would intensify, reinforcing a vicious cycle. Scarcity leads to conflict, and conflict deepens scarcity. This dynamic could prolong the war and expand red zones into previously stable regions. A world forever changed. Even if World War III were to end without total annihilation, the world that emerged afterward would be fundamentally different. Economic recovery could take decades, and social trust might be permanently damaged. Entire regions could experience long-term instability, while global cooperation would need to be rebuilt almost from scratch.